So thanks everybody. Again, if you've just joined us online, I'm Andy Wood, Conservation Planning Specialist at Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department, and I'm part of the Community Wildlife Program. And I'm really thrilled to be sharing BioFinder 3.0 with you. This is an amazing tool that the Agency of Natural Resources has made available to you. And we're going to dig into some of the things that you can do with BioFinder. Just a couple housekeeping notes here. You've already passed the first test by getting into this virtual workshop space with Microsoft Teams. You'll be seeing some sort of version of this toolbar on your own computer screen. And I'll just point out that you should have some degree of control over your video and your microphone. For now, I'd ask that you mute the microphone. We'll pause later in the presentation and open it up to questions. And at that point, if folks have questions, you can unmute and ask your question. There's also a chat function. I think most everybody will be able to see this. So if you think of a question throughout the presentation, you can enter that into the chat as well, and we'll try to get to that at the most appropriate section. Some people may not be able to see that chat function, and if that's the case for you, know that you can just ask your question over your microphone during the break for questions. And I'll just point out too that let me just get my highlighter here, that you'll need to hit this little paper airplane button to actually submit your question. So before we dive into BioFinder, I just want to remind folks that although we're going to be talking about technology and maps and data, this is all really about real places in Vermont. These are places in your community and oftentimes places that we love and we're extremely passionate about. So I just don't want folks to forget that and get too buried in the data. Everything that you'll see in BioFinder is based on a real place. So today we'll start with some introductions, who we are, where we're coming from in our relationship to BioFinder. We'll talk about BioFinder itself and the data within it, Vermont conservation design. I'll review a selection of useful tools that you'll find in the BioFinder, and then we'll talk a little bit about how you can use it in your community. Jens and I both work for the Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department, and we believe in the conservation of our fish, wildlife, plants, and their habitats for the people of Vermont. And many people are surprised to learn that the mission of the Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department includes the conservation of all wild living things, from bumblebees to bobcats, brook trout to trees, as well as the natural communities and the habitats they need to thrive. And we do this by serving all Vermonters, from hunters and anglers to people who just like to look at wildlife from a distance. As part of the Community Wildlife Program, we work closely with towns and communities, and there are other folks on our staff who provide direct assistance to landowners looking to improve habitat on their property. And all of us at the department take our commitment to future generations seriously. We get up every day and we go to work to make sure that the wildlife and the wild places around us will still be here for our children and grandchildren to enjoy. One of the ways that we serve Vermonters is through sharing information that our department scientists have collected and created. And so, as I mentioned, Jens and I are the Community Wildlife Program staff, and we do presentations like this. Right now, we're fully online, but under more normal circumstances, we'd be out meeting with town boards and other community members and supporting conservation, sharing data, and helping folks put these kinds of resources into action in a more boots on the ground way. So what is this BioFinder? Well, I'm going to break it down into three main categories. First, it's a free online portal for information on Vermont's biodiversity. Second, it's a mapping tool showing important ecological features at different scales. And third, it's the home for Vermont conservation design, which is a statewide data set of the most important ecological areas. And we created the BioFinder to be this one-stop shop where Vermonters could come and get access to all of these three elements. So if you're at home, you can type in biofinder.vermont.gov, and that'll bring you to the BioFinder website. From there, you're just one click away from getting into the free online portal. And I'll mention that at that website address, we've created a number of other resources to help you get the most out of your BioFinder experience. I'll briefly mention that we've had a lot of help in creating this. All of these partners and organizations on the screen have played a role in different phases of developing BioFinder, and the project has been going on for a number of years now, and so we're really pleased to share this version 3.0 that has some of the latest and greatest features. So as I said, it's a free online portal, and now more than ever, we have time to explore these online resources. So pop open that web browser, type it in, and it'll bring you to this page. This is what you see when you open up the BioFinder portal. Second, BioFinder is a mapping tool, and the way I like to explain this is it's a great way to explore places around you. So you can check out your favorite spot near your house, learn about it in a different way, or you can explore somewhere that you've never been that you'd like to learn more about. BioFinder is designed so that you can make an actual map from the data that's there. So later we'll talk about how you can add in different layers and print out and share maps. And that sharing is really important. We're hoping that folks will get acquainted with the BioFinder, learn about the data that's there, and then share what they find with those around them, whether that's friends or family, coworkers, or local town officials. Third, BioFinder is the home for Vermont conservation design, which is a data set at its core, but it's also our department's strategy for protecting and enhancing ecological function into the future. And what I mean by ecological function is the ability of plants and animals to interact as they need to in order to thrive, reproduce, migrate, and move, even as the climate changes. So Vermont conservation design shows up as data, but again, as I said in the beginning of the presentation, they represent, the data that's in there represents real places on the ground, from our lakes and ponds to our rivers and forests. So this data set is based in reality, but it's also projecting into the future a network of lands and waters that can provide that ecological function for all of the species that live in Vermont. This Vermont conservation design is a big part of how we fulfill our department's mission and our strategy for protecting all of Vermont's biodiversity. This is a huge task, and this image that I'm showing you here shows the rough breakdown of all of the different species in Vermont by category. So you can see, you know, our most familiar species, the vertebrate animals, there's just a little more than 400, but we think there's somewhere between 15 to 20,000 different invertebrate species. All in all, we estimate that there are somewhere between 24,000 and 43,000 species in Vermont. That's a ton. We don't know a lot about many of these species, especially the understudied groups like insects, algae, fungi, and lichens. And so from a conservation perspective, it's inefficient for us to work one species at a time. There just aren't enough people, money, or resources to put that individual attention towards each and every species. So Vermont conservation design is that practical strategy. And it works by applying what we call the coarse filter method of conservation. And so, you know, if you think about filter here, think about like a colander that you'd strain your pasta, and the coarse is a larger filter. And the idea there is that if you take a habitat like a forest and protect good examples of that forest, you're going to bring along all the other species that live there, from the reptiles and amphibians to the plants and the birds and the insects. That'll get you protecting most of the things that live in the forest, although some individual species might fall through the cracks of that colander. And so if you do that for all of the other habitats of Vermont, go beyond the forest to the wetlands and the cliffs and the rivers, you'll bring along and protect most of the species that live in those habitats. So Vermont Conservation Design takes that strategic approach, applies it across the entire Vermont landscape, and looks at the different habitat features on the land that together make up a network we're confident can protect most of the species we're charged with protecting. This is conservation at different scales. We start by looking at the landscapes. This is our coarsest filter of conservation. That'll capture a lot of what's out there. Then we start to zoom into the community level, and we'll catch the things that might not get captured in the landscape vision scale, but are occurring more at the local level. And then finally, we recognize that there are some species that are always going to need special attention that just won't be protected by working only at the landscape or the community level. And an example for this is, there's no map of areas in Vermont where all the bumblebees are. The reality is you're just going to have to look at bumblebees in a specialist way if you want to go about the business of protecting and conserving them. And so in BioFinder, you'll see this applied at all these different scales. And in the next section of this presentation, we're going to get at navigating through the different data sets and layers of data that you'll find in the BioFinder. But we'll just pause here. I'll get a drink of water, and then if anybody has any questions, Jens, if you could read out questions in the chat.
There's nothing in there at this time, Andy, but folks, you should feel free to write into the chat at any time or unmute your mics.
Okay, I'm hearing cricket, so we'll keep going, but know that we'll pause again in the future.
Sorry, one did just come up. When did the initiative to make BioFinder first start?
Jens,
2012.
2012?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the first version of BioFinder was in 2012. Then we created a new version in 2016, and so this is the third version now.
Okay, so when you get into the BioFinder, the first image that you'll see is this overall Vermont conservation design priorities. And it shows that the outline of the state with a whole lot of dark green and light green. And I see this as kind of an aquamarine teal as the other color that's in there. Those colors that you see on the map are what we consider the most ecologically important places in Vermont. These are the places that maintain nature and its benefits, from the clean air and providing clean air and water, habitat for our species, but these are also the lands that are important for our communities by protecting against excess flooding, and they fuel our outdoor economy, and of course they are beautiful, which is one thing that draws a lot of us to Vermont. So what you see here is a two-tier system, what we call the highest priority and the priority. So in this case, the darkest greens are the highest priority areas, and the darkest blues are also highest priority. And then the lighter versions of those color are what we call priority. We'll talk more about that a little bit later. But collectively, they make up this network that we're saying is overall the way we go about protecting ecological function into the future. And I just want to note that you may have noticed a lot of Vermont is covered by this map layer. And in fact, 68% of this map is highest priority areas. And so when we talk about conservation of these areas, we need to be realistic that conservation is going to mean all different kinds of land management actions, not just buying and conserving land. But the key here is that anywhere you see mapped in this layer, is an area where we need to be thinking about land management that will enhance ecological function. So I'm going to take you through some of the other layers that you'll see by going to the community where I live, and this is Montpelier. And of course, you can go to the community you live in. And what I like to start people off with is say, go to your community and just look at the overall patterns that show up in this overall priorities of Vermont conservation design layer. Now, what I see here is, let me change that. What I see here is that the river network in Montpelier is showing up as that darkest green as the highest priority. And then these areas around it showing up as the lighter green are priority. What that means is just we don't have enough data to support that these lightest green areas are our highest priority. We know they're important. We know they're playing a supportive role, but we don't know with the same certainty as we do that these dark green areas are providing the highest ecological value. So that's kind of neat to look at my community. I can see here there's a big block of dark green over here along the Middlesex line. So look at the pattern, and the next thing I'd encourage you to do is just click around. So if I click on this area of the North Branch of the Winooski, this little map tips box pops up, and it'll show me a number of these highest priority features and priority features, and anything that's present in that area where I clicked will show up with a green checkbox. So what this is telling me is that in this area that I just clicked, there are surface water and riparian areas, riparian and wildlife connectivity, and physical landscape diversity features that are mapped in this area as highest priority. If I click on another area of the map, it shows me that there is a priority vernal pool in this area. So click around the map in your community and just see what there is to see. Don't worry, you can't break it. You just click, 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 and see what there is to see. Once you've looked at your community at a more local layout scale, I'd encourage you to zoom out. And so here's Montpelier, but zoomed out to kind of the middle third of the state. And what I notice here is that Montpelier is just to the east of this massive block of priority and highest priority lands. Here are some of the mountain ranges in our local community that pop out as being just so important for ecological function. So this gives me some context for where Montpelier sits in the landscape. Now remember, these are real places in Vermont. So this is a picture from me maybe 2 years ago in Hubbard Park, which is one of the natural areas in my community where I spend a lot of time jogging and looking at birds and looking for wildflowers. It's just a fabulous place that is important for the species around me, but also for my own well-being and my communities. So we're going to dive into the BioFinder layers through the lens of Hubbard Park. Hubbard Park is an area that we call a habitat block. And what I mean by a habitat block is an area of natural cover, excuse me, that's 20 acres or larger and surrounded by roads, development, and agriculture. So the Agency of Natural Resources undertook an effort to map all of the areas in Vermont that met that criteria. So chances are there's a habitat block like this near you. Now note that this has nothing to do with land ownership. This is just natural land cover, so forests and wetlands and areas that just aren't developed. So here's Hubbard Park here. It is part of a habitat block that measures about 840 acres in size. And this habitat blocks data set eventually became the backbone for the different layers that you'll see in BioFinder. So this is the skeleton upon which we built many more layers that you'll see. Okay, so let's dive into those layers, starting with the ones mapped at the landscape level. So when you get into BioFinder, in the layer menu, you'll see this landscape components. If you click that, it'll open up all these other options, and we'll go through these one by one. So the first one you'll see is the interior forest blocks. We created this data set because interior forest blocks provide a special ecological function that not every forest can provide. It's habitat for a number of species that only live in these core forest areas. And we know that these interior forests provide other ecosystem services. So we went through all of those habitat blocks in Vermont, and we chose a subset of them that offered this interior forest habitat. And then we made a map of all those areas in Vermont. So going back to Montpelier, I've turned on this interior forest blocks. Excuse me, I've got a little cough here. Hope it's nothing serious. So here in our community, interestingly enough, this Hubbard Park area didn't make the cut to be considered a highest priority or even a priority block. And that's because in central Vermont, you have to be a pretty large forest block to make the cutoff in our data set. So that's kind of interesting because it feels like a big forest to me, but relative to these other areas, like this big block over here in Middlesex, it just doesn't offer the same ecological function at the statewide level. If you zoom out a little bit, you can see why. So here's that Hubbard Park block. And you can see when we're looking at it at a more regional level, the reality is that this Middlesex block here is much larger. And these areas up here that surround the Worcester Range, our local mountain range, they really dwarf that Hubbard Park block in terms of size. So not surprisingly, there's just more ecologically valuable interior forest in those blocks outside of Montpelier. And so that's one of the things we have to keep in mind when you're looking at BioFinder is that this is a statewide prioritization. So at the statewide level, Hubbard Park doesn't really make the cut, but at the local level, it's absolutely important. In fact, I would argue that it's one of the most important forest blocks in Montpelier, both for its ecological function, but also for the service that it provides to our community as a recreation area. So at any rate, that's just something that you'll want to keep in mind as you explore this this data set in BioFinder. Oh yeah, and there's just an arrow pointing out the Worcester Range. So the next layer that you'll see is called the connectivity blocks. Connectivity blocks is really all about connecting different parts of the landscape. This is critically important for our wildlife species that need to move around in large areas and disperse beyond the areas in which they were born. Having a connected landscape is also going to be really important in building climate resilience into our network of habitat here in Vermont. And of course, by providing wildlife with the ability to move to different areas will allow for more genetic exchange. So what does it look like when you go into the BioFinder? Well, here again, I have the interior forest pulled up, and you'll notice that they're kind of disconnected. There's not a continuous pathway between them. When you turn on the connectivity blocks, here we're identifying other areas that may not necessarily provide that interior forest habitat, but they're pieced together, creating a more connected network across the landscape. And I'll just point out that in this image, because we have the interior forest turned on at the same time as the connectivity blocks, this purple is actually displaying on top of a highest priority connectivity block that's mapped over the Worcester Range. So if I were live in BioFinder, I could turn that off, and then you would see that this area is also mapped as connectivity. So this is an interesting way to look at the landscape. Here's a connectivity block that shows up as a priority block connecting that Worcester Range, or excuse me, that Middlesex block up to the Worcester Range. And then here is a highest priority connectivity block. This is the Shutesville Hill Wildlife Corridor area. And it's highest priority because it's one of the only remaining ways that we can connect the habitat around Mount Mansfield over to the Worcester Range. It's that pinch point, the last kind of remaining area of connected habitat. And we're really emphasizing this connectivity in BioFinder. Maintaining connections is extremely important in terms of supporting ecological function. So here's another way to look at it. If I color all of the areas in this community that would meet the criteria to be a habitat block, you can see that we have a relatively intact network along the left of the image, but there's a big gap here and not a good way to get from this side of the landscape over to this side of the landscape. Fortunately, in this area, we have these other smaller areas, these habitat connectors, that if pieced together can provide that connectivity function and connect the larger habitat blocks to each other. This is neat because, you know, this small patch of forest, ecologically, it doesn't have much to offer functionally by itself. But connected to these other areas, it's supporting that network and allowing species to disperse across the landscape. And so collectively, by laying out a map of connectivity blocks throughout the state, we're creating pathways from north to south to east to west that crisscross the entire state and allow species that might be moving in from other states around us to pass through our state through continuous areas of quality habitat. And if you kind of zoom out from Vermont, this is especially important. To our west, we have the Adirondacks, which is a really important core area of habitat. And then to the east and the north, we have additional high quality areas of habitat in New Hampshire, Maine, and Quebec. So Vermont is at that crossroads for species that are going to need to move large distances across the landscape, whether that's due to their own life history needs or whether that's in response to climate change. Vermont is at the crossroads of these other major areas. So anything that we do here in the state will have extra importance. Okay, so in Vermont, it's not all just forest blocks and connected forest blocks. There's another way we can enhance that connectivity, and that's through looking at our surface waters and riparian areas. And by riparian, what I mean is simply areas along banks of rivers, streams, lakes, and ponds. These areas, of course, provide all kinds of wildlife habitat and connectivity. And they're really important for our communities too. They buffer us from floodwaters and provide ways to filter water and protect its water quality. So in BioFinder, you'll see a layer here called surface waters and riparian areas. Again, we've divvied this up into areas that we know are highest priority and areas that are priority. And going back to Montpelier here, you can see that pattern. Here's the north branch of the Winooski. Here's the main stem of the Winooski, and a number of other tributaries. This makes sense, right? That the rivers themselves are the highest priority, and some of the riparian areas around them are playing that supporting role. Zooming out, I love this image because it shows just how connected we are to the rest of the state through that surface area and riparian network. What we do in our waterways matters downstream. And in this case, that's the entire remainder of the Winooski River watershed. So, you know, think about the river network in your community and check that out in BioFinder. There's another layer you'll see called riparian wildlife connectivity. I'm not going to dive into this too much, but this is a model that we built to really key out areas that provide wildlife habitat connectivity along that network. So, you know, we took the surface waters and riparian areas and subtracted some areas out that were developed. So this is a way we can look at the landscape and plan for some of those specialist species like wood turtle or otter that are very dependent on the riparian areas. You'll also see two layers in the landscape level that are physical landscape diversity and physical landscape blocks. And these are the diverse bedrock soils, elevations, and landforms in Vermont. And we know through inventory that the most diverse biophysical areas tend to have the highest numbers of overall species. So they're the current hotspots of biodiversity. And we know that as climate changes, while we have some species that may move out of Vermont, we strongly suspect that other species moving into Vermont will also occupy these sort of niche physical habitats. And so in a way, we're focused on conserving the stage, even if the players on that stage may be changing through time. When you look at them through the BioFinder, they show up in this awesome color palette of pinks, yellows, and reds. And those are symbolized to represent their relative rarity within the state and within the region. So this is a neat way to learn a little bit more about what's underneath the plants and animals and kind of driving those other larger patterns of biodiversity in the state. So those are the landscape components, and then you'll also see a variety of community and species components. Again, these are conservation layers zoomed in at a more local scale. And there are data layers that encompass natural communities, aquatic habitats, rare and uncommon species, and all of these other ones that I've listed here. Each of these is a huge, interesting data set in their own, and we won't be diving deep into them today in this presentation, but I'd encourage you to check them out. There's a ton of information in there, and I guarantee there's something near your community that will fall in this category. These are all parts of that ecologically functional landscape, again, that aren't going to be captured through landscape scale conservation, but will require that slightly finer scale of attention. And so going back to Montpelier, if I turn on all of these community and species components, you'll see this scatter shot of different features that show up in BioFinder. Here we've got some wetlands over here. Here's a vernal pool up in Hubbard Park that I run by. I'm keeping an eye on the amphibian eggs up there. And there's another feature over here not far from my office. So this is a great way to look at what's happening on the local level, what is going to add value to your conservation priorities in that more zoomed in scale. So going back to that first layer that we talked about, the overall priorities, those dark greens and light greens and the aquamarine blues, what those really are just the landscape scale maps meshed in with the community and species scale maps and color coded into the blue-green scheme to represent the overall priorities. So if you're not feeling like you want to dive into the individual layers within the landscape scale or the communities and species scale, you can just start with this overall priorities map and know that what's color coded here is capturing everything that's happening at these three different scales. This is the unified single map that you can go to if you're pressed for time. Okay, I think we'll pause there for questions. Jens, if you've got any, read them out.
Yeah, Andy, there's been a few things going on the chat. One of them is Matthew was asking, does this mirror, tie in, or replace the ANR Natural Resource Atlas?
That's a great question. So in some ways, what you see in BioFinder, much of that data is also in the ANR Atlas, but it's not prioritized in the same way that it is in BioFinder. The other thing that I would say is through BioFinder, you can access the different abstracts for each of the layers that tells you how they were built and how we went about the process of prioritizing what would be highest priority or not included. So it's been a little bit more interpreted than what you would find in the ANR Atlas. But definitely the underlying data, such as the rare and uncommon species, that's drawing on the same database of natural heritage data. Great question.
Thanks, Andy. And Susan had written in about whether we're partnering with the Nature Conservancy and other organizations, and I had said that we are. And she said that this mapping tool is amazing, and she hopes it's being actively shared with other groups. And then Maggie followed on and said that she was agreeing with Susan and asked, do you know if other states are implementing something like BioFinder? If not, this is a great tool and concept that I hope is being shared and adopted across the states. I'm happy to handle that, or if you want to, or whatever you'd like.
Yeah, maybe I'll chime in and then you can add your 2 cents. But there are similar initiatives in other states. I did some work in Massachusetts years back. I can't remember the exact name of it, but they've undertaken similar efforts to map diversity and highlight important areas. And I know Maine as well has a interactive web tool called Beginning with Habitat that is similar in some ways, but really all of these different efforts are harnessing the power of GIS data and giving us lots of different ways to look at the data. Jens, maybe you can chime in more specifically.
Yeah, the Massachusetts effort is called Biomap 2. And you mentioned beginning with habitat. In New Hampshire, they have their wildlife action plan. And all of those efforts do show focal areas and areas of ecological importance, but none of them really show that landscape scale of connectivity the way BioFinder does. And so I think Vermont Conservation Design and the BioFinder website is really ahead of its time in really focusing on that landscape scale. Susan was also asking, how are priority levels determined? Rarity, importance of ecological services, level of development pressure, how are those determined?
That's a great question. There's a variety of reasons why some layers were keyed out as highest priority versus priority. And what we'll do is we'll share the different abstracts that tell you just exactly how we made those decisions. That's a bit of a broad answer, but because there's so many layers in the BioFinder, I would say it depends. But one of the things that we take into consideration when we make those calls is that Vermont is really variable. If you're living and working in central Vermont, the landscape is fundamentally different than it is down in the valleys on either side of the mountains. And so what is an ecologically functional forest? Well, that depends on where you live. If you're in the greens, there are these huge tracts of forest, but down in the valleys, the forests are smaller. And at the same time, some of those smaller forests still manage to have really high amounts of biodiversity because of the geologic or glacial history in that area. So, we've tried to take all of the knowledge of these elements and contextualize them in a way that that is sensitive to those regional variations.
And then one more, are other Vermont state agencies informed of the uses of BioFinder when completing their work? For example, deciding where to place new roads or housing and community development, public utilities, that sort of thing.
You know, we've had a lot of involvement within the Agency of Natural Resources. So certainly our partners at Forest Parks and Rec and the Department of Environmental Conservation. And we do work collaboratively with other organizations. So Jens does a lot of work in collaboration with the Agency of Transportation. But there's definitely lots of folks out there, and we're always looking for ways to spread that message and get folks to be thinking about their projects more ecologically.
This is my comment, Andy, but would you just talk about Act 171 and how that's a tie-in with the Agency of Commerce and Community Development?
Absolutely. So we support towns working on complying with Act 171, which requires town plans to identify forest blocks and habitat connectors, and then to plan for development in a way that limits the fragmentation and the ecological degradation of those features. So for a town that doesn't already have that kind of language in their town plan, we're working with them to use tools like BioFinder to identify those features that serve as forest blocks and connectors, and to put those into maps, and then eventually codify that in other ways into local planning. So that's a way that this science is moving out of the scientist realm and into the world of land use planning. And I'll just put in a plug. There's a slide later in this presentation where I'll show two other presentations that we're offering in the upcoming weeks. So if you're a land use planner or you're involved in town level planning, we have a whole other training that's focused on how do you get that data out of BioFinder and into a workable plan in your community. Great question. Any other questions out there? Okay, I'm hearing crickets, so I think I'll keep going. But we'll pause again. So I want to briefly take you through some of the tools that are available in BioFinder. The first thing I'll point out is there's a toolbar button you can click here that has this crossed screwdriver and wrench. And once you click on that, it'll pop open this toolbar just below the BioFinder logo. In here, there are, gosh, I don't know, maybe 50 different tool functions that you can use to add data, manipulate data, draw in the BioFinder, and pull data out. So there's a lot in there. One of the features I think you'll find most useful is the identify menu. So this is a way that you can select specific data in the BioFinder and either learn more about it or begin to manipulate that data. So for example, here, if I click on this feature here that's showing up in BioFinder, this happens to be a natural community. And what's really neat is that it tells me that it's a northern white cedar swamp. Here, I'll point out that it gives me a link to the component abstract. So this is what I was referring to when I mentioned that we explain the selection criteria that dictates what is highest priority and what is priority. So this northern white cedar swamp was identified as a highest priority feature. And I selected this just by clicking on it with the identify point, but you could also draw a box around this area and identify the wetlands in addition to the natural community that's there. You can also learn more about the underlying data by clicking the additional details. And I apologize, I realize this is very small, but here I clicked on this wetland feature. And then when I click on the additional details, it gives me a readout of some of the embedded data that goes along with that feature. So in this case, it tells me it's a class 2 wetland that's highest priority. And that might be useful data in this case if you're looking at land use planning around this wetland, or if you just are curious about that kind of thing. Once you've gotten the hang of selecting data, then you can go about the business of exporting it. So what you see in this screenshot here was I was still within that identify tool. I clicked on the rectangle and then I drew a rectangle around this area and picked up that highest priority natural community as well as priority and highest priority wetlands. So that's my selection of what I've captured, those 13 features. Now, if I click on this little menu bar here, it'll drop down this menu of export options. So here I can export to a shapefile, and this is useful for bringing it into GIS. I really like Excel, so sometimes I export things into a spreadsheet format using one of these two options. And the benefit of that is you can take it out of BioFinder and move it into a different program that you might be more comfortable with. I'll also mention, let me just back up a slide, that you can export something of interest to a shapefile and then reload it back into the BioFinder. So let's say there's a wetland near your home in your community that you think is really important. You can select it, export it, and then bring it back into BioFinder. And from there, you can have a little bit more flexibility with how you display the different layers and how they overlap with each other. So that's kind of a more advanced way you can use that select, export, and then re-import that data. There are also a variety of ways you can share what it is that you find in BioFinder. So again, in that toolbar, if you go to Map Tools, you'll notice these three functions: share, export, and print. Share allows you to, pass along what's captured in your screen to somebody else so they can look at the same thing you're looking at. Export gives you a bunch of different options. And then the print function I think is really neat because it brings you to this nice formatted map. You could change the title of this if you want, such as, interesting wetland near my home. You can customize these notes and it'll display the different layers that you have over here in the legend. So that's a neat way if you want to map something and then make it a little bit more presentable for sharing. Okay, I'll pause there. I know I sort of ran through those different tools, but if folks have questions related to different tools, I'll take those now. Jens, can you all still hear me?
Yep, we're hearing you fine. Just no questions at this time. Sorry, Andy.
No, that's okay. Sometimes you just wonder, I'm speaking into the void. So yeah, to summarize, there's a lot of different tools in there. If you want to learn more about those, I'd say just start by clicking around. And if you're having trouble with any of those, you can reach out to me and I can provide some more support and show you some tips and tricks. So the final section here, I want to briefly mention some ways that you can put BioFinder to work in your community. As we've alluded to a couple times in this presentation, there are many applications for town and regional land use planning. The Community Wildlife Program assists with revisions to town plans, writing in descriptions of these features and ways to protect them. We help with Act 171 compliance, and we also provide a community values mapping service where we can come into your community and help you identify what's most important to the people that live in that community and how those features interact with the ecologically functional landscape. So that's sort of one avenue that many of you on the call are already involved with. And so we hope BioFinder will provide tools to support that work. And we are very happy to assist you in all manners of that. Many Vermonters own forest or live near forests that are managed. And so a potential application is BioFinder could be used to enhance the way we think about forest management planning. So I'll show you an example. Here's a stand map that perhaps you might get from a forester, and these are incredible resources for understanding your woodlot and thinking about how to manage for it. If I look at this same parcel in BioFinder, I start to get some additional ecological context. So what I notice here is that this middle area of the property is showing up as highest priority in those overall priorities layers in Vermont conservation design. But what I'm also seeing in here is this large community and species scale feature, which in this case is a wetland. You can kind of see it over here in the stand map, but what I see here is what happens in this property is bound up and related to what's happening in all of these other properties around it. So BioFinder can give you that context for how your land interacts with the land around it. It'll get you beyond that parcel level thinking. I'll share this example briefly. So this is a landowner who went through some extensive planning processes to figure out how they wanted to use their 100-acre property. And so they identified those forest blocks as green. They identified where they wanted to have the housing in orange, and then these blue and yellow areas were identified as agricultural areas. So that landowner could go into BioFinder and see what's around them. And in this case, an interesting feature that pops up here is that stream layer that cuts up through the middle of the property. So same parcel, but different map showing that, hey, there's a really cool opportunity here to enhance ecological function. So that's a way that some folks might choose to look at their land and use BioFinder in the Vermont conservation design layers to think about how they take care of their land. The great part about BioFinder is that you get to decide what to do with the maps. And we know that Vermonters are always balancing different priorities within their communities. But we recognize that having a healthy ecological system around us ties into those healthy economy and healthy community pieces. So it's a balancing act. We get it. And our hope is that BioFinder just puts one more useful tool in your pocket to make that balancing act easier. As I said earlier, we have two related trainings that are happening in the coming weeks. There's this using BioFinder 3.0 for land use planning. Our next session is coming up on Monday, and then there's one later in the month. If you'd like to be a part of those, just send me an email and I'll get you set up with the links. And then we also offer this training, Vermont Conservation Design for Ecological Consultants. And so some of you, maybe you were a consultant in a past life or are still a consultant or interact with consultants in different facets of your work or life. This is a neat opportunity for that. So if you'd like to be a part of those, send me an email. here's that address, and I want to thank you for spending the time with us today. We're really pleased to be here with you. So thank you, and I'll just open up the floor for any questions at this point.
Hey, Andy, Maggie writes, what are you excited about for the future of BioFinder? For example, new layers like invasives or new uses. How do you think it might be different in 5 years?
Oh, that's a great question. I think that there are going to be applications of BioFinder that Vermonters come up with that we've never thought about. You know, just the other day, we got some great questions about how you could use BioFinder to think about restoring different parts of the landscape. So that's an element of, you know, ecological function rather than preemptively protecting it, you know, looking at degraded areas and trying to restore ecological function. So I think there's so many creative people out there that are going to learn about these data sets and find creative ways to apply them to all of the different work that they do. So that's what I'm most excited, is to get this out there and then unleash all the other brain power outside of the department to put it to work. As far as other layers to come, you know, we are having conversations about you know, what is in BioFinder that needs updating. So we'll be taking a look at that. And then I'll also point out that so much of Vermont has not had detailed inventory. So there are whole parts of the state where there just isn't a whole lot of data about rare plants, for example. And so we're trying to identify some of those gaps and improve the data sets that we have. And that's something that our professional staff are working on, but we're also partnering with citizen scientists all throughout the state. So, you know, if you're inclined, there's opportunities to contribute in that way.
And then we also had a question about the Find Me tool. And I wrote back, I guess it's an option on Mac OS that I didn't know about. So we need to get back to the person on that one.
Okay, Find Me tool. Yeah, we'll look into that. Any other questions out there?
Where is the data coming from? How often is that being updated?
The data come from a variety of different sources. So because there are so many elements to the landscape, you know, different folks are spearheading the collection of that. And as far as the updates, I don't know, Jens, do you have a sort of a batch update perspective on that?
Well, no, because it sort of depends on funding and political will. I mean, that said, you know, we created it in 2012, we updated it in 2016, then we updated it again in 2019. So it's been fairly regular, but we can't guarantee anything. And then I'm just responding that about that we'll send the link around for the YouTube.
Yes, so we are recording this session. It'll take us a couple days to get the recording processed and uploaded, and then you'll see an email from me with a link to review today's session. So that'll come right to your inbox. You don't have to go digging for it.
That's all we got, Andy. Thanks so much.
All right, thanks everybody again for tuning in today, and take care and let us know if you have any additional questions.